全球智慧型手机龙头是苹果，去年市占将近有20%，出货量达到2.4亿只。但是这样的苹果呢，它其实也面临到两难的压力，因为在中国生产具有成本的优势。不过呢，去中国化的声浪四起，面临美国的政府压力也日益剧增。那未来的苹果该何去何从呢？台湾的供应链会不会面临到其他的局势上的压力？今天我们很荣幸邀请到《金融时报》的资深记者，也是苹果在中国的作者 Patrick McGee 来分享他的看法。
I'm Patrick McGee. I was a journalist at the Financial Times for 12 years, and I'm the author of Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company.
So Apple just delivered a record-breaking quarter.
Yeah.
A revenue hit a new high, so the profits, so did its core products. How did this Apple make China from the world's factory into the world's market?
So Apple really began to consolidate their production into China in the early 2000s. And back then, made in China was synonymous with poor quality. And Apple really played this starring role, raising up quality standards across dozens and then later hundreds of factories across the country. So they had really discovered China in terms of what was possible there. But to get the quality standards that Apple needed for the products that you'll remember, the iMac, the iPod, the iPod Mini, the iPod Nano, the iPhone, it required just all sorts of quality engineering. And so Apple would literally fly plane loads of people from California over to hundreds of factories and really train everybody up. So Steve Jobs famously cared about the aesthetics of a computer, not just the front, not just the back, but the insides. And there was a cultural training and an engineering 101 to hundreds of factories. And since 2008, the number of people that Apple has trained in that fashion is 30 million, so greater than the population of Taiwan. And they've invested staggering sums such that I point out that they've been the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025. Xi Jinping's pretty ambitious plan to sever dependence on the West and be self-sufficient in high-end electronics.
For years, China's role in Apple was the final assembly, low value work, labor intensive, but that's not the big picture of the whole situation. How does Apple see this situation of Apple squeeze?
Yeah, that's kind of a misconception. I don't think that China was ever really just doing final assembly. It's just that people put focus on Foxconn, and Foxconn's role is actually itself not even just defined as final assembly, but it's the thing that people know about Foxconn. But so much more was happening. So Foxconn would be the sort of the central site in a new location, maybe in Shenzhen or Chengdu or Zhengzhou. But then it's like a hub and spoke model. So around Shenzhen, you would have the anodizing, the metal stamping, the plastic injection molding, the tool and die making, and so forth. And so that's why Foxconn would develop these enormous campuses. So China really introduced onto the world stage something they call next door manufacturing. So the idea being that you can just really cross the street or go next door to really get sort of everything you need for the entire supply chain. So what Apple was doing back then, working closely with Terry Guo, working closely with Foxconn, was building these entire industrial clusters, these enormous ecosystems. And from Apple's perspective, when they were building products in Taiwan or Korea or Japan, they were having to rely on entire networks of countries. And Apple, through China, was able to basically take what was in multiple countries and across borders and passport control and everything, do it in a single neighborhood. So China just sort of wins all the orders over the course of time, and all of Apple production begins to consolidate into a single country.
Would China look the same today?
Yeah, it's a bizarre thing to say, right? That is the thesis of the book. I don't think it's really even contested that Apple couldn't really be Apple without China. I think everybody is familiar with that. But yeah, I argue that Apple played an instrumental role really building up China. Now, of course, they did that with the Chinese. I'm not trying to discredit, the actual role of the sort of people from the rural hinterlands that build up places like Shenzhen, but they often did it at the directive of the Taiwanese manufacturers, and their biggest client was often Apple. And Apple was far more demanding than HP or Dell or Sony or any of the other Western companies that were operating on the mainland. And if you think about what manufacturing means, it is the most important thing to Xi Jinping. Right? Manufacturing is what has brought China onto the world stage, taking the Guangdong model and then expanding it, sort of replicating it across the country. So it's not some niche space, it's the thing that we associate with China.
But for years, like Apple delivered a list of top 200 suppliers, and that's often be seen as a scorecard to see how Apple is like getting rid of China. But is that a real thing that Apple?
So it's almost disinformation what Apple puts out every year. So it's a list of the top 200 suppliers, but it's only looking at their tier 1 suppliers.
Oh.
And in a certain sense, the significance of Apple is that they take control not just of the tier 1, but the tier 2, the tier 3, the tier 4. Right? So it's not just Foxconn, it's the company supplying Foxconn, and it's the next layer of companies that are supplying the supplier to Foxconn, and then it's even down a further layer. So Apple's control extends so far beyond those 200 suppliers that, in a sense, it doesn't matter so much what the composition is when you're counting factory by factory, because the problem with those top 200 is they're treating the factory as a unit of one. And so what you end up have is that you're looking at maybe 50 factories in China and 50 factories across Southeast Asia without realizing that one factory in China can imply more labor than 20 factories across these other places. So I have internal documents from Apple that make it a lot more clear that there's been a real Chinification in the supply chain. I mean, to be fair, that is clear in the top 200 list, but it's even more abundant. It's even more of a Chinification story than the public documents would attest.
Someone said that India is a new China, but why is China so special? Is China replaceable?
Yeah, I would love India to be the new China, but at the moment I would short that idea. There's so many reasons to believe that China will continue to expand its manufacturing footprint. It's sort of like an all-nation effort. If you talk to people, including ordinary people, all the way up to government ministers in India, manufacturing is just one of the things that they're interested in. They're sort of dipping their toe in the water of manufacturing, whereas I think China has like a Nietzschean will to power based on manufacturing and based on an understanding that they can develop choke points in the international supply chain. So that's why you've seen China go after technologies that are going to be cutting edge and really relevant for the rest of the 21st century. So electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, solar cells, right? Those are all necessary things for the green revolution. Getting off of fossil fuels and building something in green technologies. Same thing with rare earth metals, right? They don't just do the mining, they do the refining. And it's an international effort, like based out of China, but they will take the metals out of Africa, right, and have these vast operations. So China's not really trying to create an interdependent world the way America did after World War II. They're trying to really do everything themselves. And so it's disconcerting that Apple is inadvertently, to some extent, playing such a role helping China do that, because the US and China are deep adversaries at the moment with very different value systems.
And speaking of technology in China, is Huawei a threat to Apple?
Huawei is a threat much more than just to Apple. So sometimes people call Huawei China's Apple, but it's also China's Ericsson. It's also China's Qualcomm, and it wants to be China's TSMC and China's NVIDIA. I mean, it's an enormously important company with capabilities well beyond that of any American corporation.
Does Apple's supply chain help to build Huawei?
Yes, so not directly. It's not that Apple employees are within a Huawei factory teaching them anything. It's that Apple very much, they invented the smartphone, right? I mean, technically you could talk about a BlackBerry or something like that, but every smartphone today is in some way derivative of the original 2007 iPhone. So not only did Apple invent it, but it was made in China, and they had to build up these industrial ecosystems we talked about, which might have been multinational. It was a lot of Taiwanese, Korean, Japanese, American companies, even German companies, but more and more of it over the course of many years became located in China for the efficiencies, the abundant labor, the flexible labor, the cheap labor, et cetera. And so as more of it was happening in China, they were training up these world-class suppliers and then specifically telling the supplier, don't be so dependent on us because we need to retain the flexibility that the iPhone goes in a different direction next year. Johnny Ive comes up with a new idea and we no longer need these 5 suppliers. But if those 5 suppliers are 95% dependent on Apple, they might go bankrupt, right? Because they've made all these investments and then Apple doesn't need them anymore. So it would specifically tell suppliers, as fast as you're growing with us, please grow that fast with somebody else. So the implicit message was, I need to go supply someone else to, with all the skill sets that Apple has trained me on. And that is where it's indirect. They would go supply Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, right? So there's an indirect support in which Apple played an instrumental rise in the rise of Huawei as a smartphone maker. But it's not that Apple was in the factories of Huawei. It's slightly less direct than that.
And Apple's so different, like from Samsung, they have their own factory, but Apple's factory is in China.
Yeah.
So the situation is a lot of different, right?
It's a really big difference. The comparison I have is like that of Uber, right? So Uber is the largest taxi provider in the world, but it doesn't own any cars.
And Airbnb.
And Airbnb. And Apple sort of did the same thing with global manufacturing. So, they were not they were not sort of cutting edge when they moved to China. They were late to China. HP had been in China since the late 1980s. Motorola came a few years later. Lots of companies were investing in China. But typically what they did is they started a joint venture, right? So half the company would be owned by Motorola, the other half would be owned by some Chinese partner. And Apple got around that. I actually have never figured out whether they did it in a savvy way or if it's just because Apple had already given up on the idea of manufacturing. Because this model that they developed where they don't build their own factory, but they instead train the factory, they sort of take control without owning it. In fact, they own the machinery in the factory at times. They spend billions of dollars on the machinery, but the employees are not their employees. The factories are not theirs. There's no factory in China that has a bitten fruit outside as the logo. But that model came up, they started doing that in Taiwan and in Korea, so places that were not demanding a JV. So they replicated that strategy in China. And I've never figured out whether it was savvy or kind of a bit of luck that they avoided the JV model.
And for years, like designed in the US and made in China and collaborate with Taiwanese suppliers.
Yes.
This situation is sound like a benefit to all the countries, but is that changed right now?
I mean, it's always been a tremendous benefit that you have these like Goliaths out of the Western world building over in Asia. The concept came from, it was coined by Stanley Shi in Taiwan in the early 1990s. He talks about the smiley curve of product development, or the smile curve. And it was sort of the basis of outsourcing. So the thesis was that the value of designing a product, let's think of the iPhone, would be in the product design, the product conception, and then you outsource the logistics and the manufacturing, and then the value comes back up for the branding and the retail. So you sort of think of Johnny Ive over here and the Apple Store over here, and this is Foxconn and this is China. And that kind of worked really well if you have a profit-centric version of capitalism, right? So doing that really well is why NVIDIA is worth $5 trillion, why Apple is worth $4 trillion. But I think at the national level, what China figured out is that it's not a smiley curve, it's a grumpy curve. And all the value at the national level is in the logistics and the manufacturing. So 25 years after the relationship really began between Apple and China, America doesn't really know how to build stuff anymore. And even if we know how, we don't have the ability to actually execute. Whereas China absolutely has the ability to execute, and they also know how to do it as well. So China sort of ended up with all of the technological capabilities, and America's just left with big profit centers. But I think in the long term, I'd much rather have the national capabilities than the profits. Profits can dwindle. National capabilities can last decades. So yeah, so TSMC is making investments in Arizona. I think it's $165 billion. Yeah, and TSMC is also building in Japan and Germany. And I know that's a really big story for Taiwan. And it's a contentious story because of the silicon shield, right, that sort of Taiwan has, is that they have this sort of chokehold over the global economy, and so that deters Beijing from invading. And so the Taiwanese are often concerned that, well, wait a minute, if we sort of transfer that technology to America, to Germany, to Japan, then maybe Taiwan's not so important, and it makes it easier for Beijing to take over. So it's a pretty nuanced topic. You probably know it better than I do. But I think what TSMC is doing well is that they are expanding overseas, but they're not expanding the cutting edge technology. So Arizona, as far as I know, will always be a node behind what is possible in TSMC in Taiwan, which is smart from TSMC's perspective. But it also means that what's going on in Arizona really doesn't actually do all that much for Apple in terms of its geopolitical reliance on, let's say, China and Taiwan, because Apple, more than anyone, wants the advanced nodes. So yes, they'll be getting some production out of Arizona, but Apple's still going to be vastly dependent on Taiwan.
Will Apple back to America or just stay in China?
I don't think they could really ever build their products at scale in America. I mean, it wouldn't be, it's like, it would be obvious to say that they would have to pay much higher costs, but I actually don't think they could even be built there. Unless we're talking about just a few for political optics, right? To please Donald Trump, maybe they build 10,000 iPhones and distribute them to White House staff. But Apple builds 230, 240 million iPhones a year, and that's just one product, right? They have hundreds of millions of other products if you're counting iPads to AirTags, AirPods, etc. So that vast ecosystem just cannot be replicated really anywhere else. So the most they've really been doing is moving final assembly to places like Vietnam and China. But there's very little evidence that that's because Tim Cook understands that there's a geopolitical risk in China. It's more that countries, America, are tariffing China. And so if you just do the final assembly in Vietnam or India, then you're not hit with those tariffs. So it's a tariff play, which I think is actually quite different from a geopolitical wake-up.
Is that the same strategy as China Plus One strategy?
Well, it would be if they were actually bifurcating the supply chain and sort of replicating every inch of what's capable in China and doing that someplace else. And India is really the only country on the planet where they have the same amount of people and a similar land mass to actually get it done, plus the wages that are comparable to where China was 20 years ago. If they don't do India and they focus on Vietnam, they hit the supply constraints when they are at 10% capacity, because Vietnam is like 1/15 the size of China. So then the question is, well, can they do it with Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, etc.? But then you're completely losing that next door capacity that we talked about earlier, right? That's China's big advantage. So you could have more resilience in the supply chain by having factories scattered across different bodies of water, but you'd be giving up a lot of efficiency, and Apple cares a lot about efficiency, so I don't see them doing that.
How Apple sees Taiwan?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly they see the Taiwanese entrepreneurs as absolutely instrumental to their success over the last 25 years. I mean, without Terry Guo, Foxconn, Pegatron, Quanta, I don't think Apple would have had the political wherewithal to figure out China. So, people sort of knowledgeable about Apple and Foxconn will know that Apple outsourced their operations, their assembly, to Foxconn. A big revelation to me when I was writing my book is that they very much outsourced their political relationship building to Foxconn as well. So, Foxconn was actually really different from the other Taiwanese contract manufacturers in the late 1990s. So it's a famously razor-thin margin business. You don't make a lot of money doing final assembly. It's often 2%, 3%, 4%. And so the likes of Quanta and Inventec were getting into the ODM model, original design manufacturer, rather than OEM, original equipment manufacturer. And what that meant was that they were allowing Western corporations not just to offload their assembly, their manufacturing, but also their R&D. And so these companies were paying more to get big name engineers into the country, designers into the company, and they would actually create like catalogs of computers where someone like Dell or HP could actually just pick those designs, right? That's so antithetical to Apple, of course. Apple's never going to have someone else build their design their computers, and then Tim Cook says, yeah, let's do that one, right? But that is what the PC industry was based on, because there was no real aesthetics to the PC, right? If you try to think back to the early 2000s, and I ask you, what's your favorite Dell computer? Nothing comes to mind. I mean, they're just little black boxes or whatever. There's no design to them. Whereas we could spend the rest of the interview just talking about our favorite Apple computers from the early 2000s. And so I think what people have missed in sort of Apple history is that if you are designing computers in a totally different way, you are also manufacturing them in a totally different way. And that's what Terry Guo picked up on in the late 1990s, that he would have all these different companies that Foxconn was already supplying to, and Apple stood out for its creativity. It also stood out for its arrogance. It also stood out for a host of reasons that others thought of as negative, but he sort of understood, they're not paying us a lot of money, but man, oh man, are they teaching us to be able to do the world-class plastic injection molding to make this computer a reality. So if people are too young to remember the computers of the late 90s and early 2000s, they should really look them up on the internet because they were doing stunningly interesting things. And Terry Guo basically made a major bet on Apple that if they can please Apple, they can please anybody.
Mm-hmm. And what is your favorite Apple product?
My favorite Apple computer is the iMac G4. That was from 2002. That was made by Quanta in Taiwan. And it wasn't a commercial success. Apple actually had to issue a profit warning a few months after it came out. They had to raise prices by $100 because of supply chain difficulties. But it's a brilliant computer. It looks sort of anthropomorphic. So it's got this base and then a neck. It's supposed to look like a sunflower, but the head moves. So it looks like it's going to dance or something, you know? And one of the first commercials was somebody sort of like mimicking their face and having the computer look at them until eventually he sticks his tongue out and then the computer's disk drive comes out as if it's a face. So, I mean, it's a brilliant computer, and I wish I could own one today, but of course it would be 20 years too slow.
So what do you think the most important things that Apples need to do right now?
Well, I would love to see them working with the Taiwanese and making major investments in India. The trouble is, I say that knowing full well that they're really constrained with making that decision. So for starters, the Taiwanese know that that's not a great return on investment because the sort of investments you make in China have a way of working out really well. Again, there's this whole nation effort behind you. And if you're wanting to get stuff built, you have local cadres at the city and provincial level who are working to get things done and wishing for your success. If you're working in India, you've got a fragmented bureaucratic government. Things don't move quickly. It's not clear that there's going to be other major companies making investments that will make the factories work and so forth. And so I just don't see India really playing out that well. But I just sort of think we have to try, because if we don't do that, and if the Taiwanese don't make major investments in India, then China is just going to continue to dominate. So, I mean, to be clear, that is the projection right now, right? There's a division of the United Nations called UNIDO, and they estimate that China has 1/3 of global manufacturing as of 2024, and that by the end of this decade, it will be 45%. So the staggering vulnerabilities that the Western world has on China are already pretty deep, and we've seen that in the arguments between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump with regard to rare earths metals. And I think we're just going to be putting ourselves in a more and more precarious position if manufacturing doesn't end up in a whole range of other countries beyond China.
And what should Taiwanese company do in this situation?
Well, so I haven't verified this, but it's been nice to be in Taiwan this week, and somebody said that 90% of foreign direct investment from Taiwan was in China maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and that number has been reduced to 10%. So it sounds like the Taiwanese are already making major diversification moves outside of China. But Apple isn't doing anything like that. So, I just think a lot of the know-how, a lot of the technical abilities are in the heads of a lot of Taiwanese people. And in a sense, Taiwan is too small to sort of take on all of Apple production. I mean, that's something that Apple recognized in the early 2000s, and I think the Taiwanese would agree with me on that. They don't have the same industrial cluster. So they need a partner, or they need several partners. But for the longest time, China was the only partner, and now the Taiwanese need to be making many more. So Mexico would be another great partner.
How was that?
Well, so Mexico has really favorable demographics, a lot of young people, and of course it's part of NAFTA, so at least in theory you have free trade with America, so if things are being built in Mexico, they should be able to work with industrial ecosystems in America and get things done. The major caveat here is that Donald Trump hates NAFTA, doesn't want there to be things made in Mexico and so forth. So a lot of the ideas that I have sort of work with the assumption that the President of the United States is someone who favors an interdependence of nations rather than a sort of authoritarian would-be dictator in the form of Donald Trump. So, if I was Taiwanese, I probably wouldn't be making the major investments that, frankly, I'm calling for until there's a different president with a more cohesive, strategic, long-term plan that actually values Taiwan. I have all sorts of problems with Donald Trump, and I am sure the Taiwanese entrepreneurs do as well.
And what risks come next to Taiwanese companies?
Well, I think it's what we've been talking about. So, Taiwanese companies, if they want to be major players on the world stage, as they already are, they can't just be in Taiwan. They need to be investing abroad. But the Taiwanese are going to be most successful in a world of global trade. And Mark Carney, my prime minister, made pretty clear at Davos last month that we're not experiencing what did he call it? He called it a rupture to that system. I'm trying to think of what the other word was he used. But we're in a whole new era right now. And so, I don't know, you'll need a better paid consultant than me, the journalist, trying to figure out what companies should do. But I just think the entire system that America really promulgated after World War II really has come to an end. And I would like to see it coming back. But that's not a bet I would put any money on.
Okay, thank you so much for your insight today. Thank you, Patrick. 苹果在中国下一章会是如何呢？或许在他选择中国作为生产基地的开始，就是一场豪赌。面对到中国和美国之间的大国博弈，供应链下一步又该如何走呢？我是志柔，谢谢你的收看。